Hi, my name is Brian Caffo, and welcome to this week's episode of Ask Brian. This week, I'm going to answer a question that I got asked a bunch, which is, can you put your slides online when J.J. Allaire visited and everyone talked about deep learning? So this was from a visit. So J.J. Allaire is the founder and CEO of RStudio, which is a great platform for doing R. And he's recently turned his attention to facilitating machine learning and artificial intelligence in R, especially through Keras. And he was kind enough to come to Johns Hopkins and give a talk and meet with all of our students and everything. And as part of his talk, the first 15 minutes, I gave an introduction to artificial intelligence as it relates to personalized medicine and public health. So what I'm going to cover here is just that talk given here in YouTube format. So I'd like to at least point out that where I'm getting a lot of this material from is from JJ's book, actually, which was written with Francois Chollet on deep learning with R. So this is a really nice book. It's, I think, by Manning Publishing. So take a look at that if you get a chance. So this has a very nice diagram. I think the diagram might be a little bit controversial, where they describe artificial intelligence as being the containing machine learning, which contains deep learning. Regardless of how you would view these circles overlapping or not, I'm going to focus entirely on deep learning. And so some of the recent benefits of deep learning include, from the book, near human level image classification, speech recognition, handwriting transcription, machine translation, and so on. So a lot of the coolest examples of deep learning that you've probably seen come from perception tasks, especially via things like convolutional neural networks and generalized adversarial networks. And I have some links in these slides. I'll put the slides in the video notes below. You should really check out this this researcher's image translation work, where they'll train, for example, on a lot of images that include horses and zebras, and then they'll use that as a generative model to, for example, switch a video that has horses into a video that has zebras in it. And the degree of realism of this is really just staggering, and certainly is not something that I would have been able to do without deep learning, or especially in this case, without this person's code. Even just a couple of years ago. Probably most everyone's initial interaction with these kinds of models would be in image classification problems, where you have a large training data set with lots of labeled images, and it's, in some cases it might just be labeling what's in the image. In other cases, it might be trying to find bounding boxes around the elements of this image. So saying that there's a person here and a dog here and a car there. A very classic example of this is classifying cats versus dogs. And in fact, here's an example I have. Here's a picture of my dog. She's a cute little dog here. She's a Labradoodle. I take a picture, press the Google Assistant, and it tries to guess what's in the picture, and it correctly predicts golden doodle. Well, it's off by a little bit. She's a Labradoodle, but close enough. So these things have become commoditized. So as an example, I was recently doing some face recognition, and I was creating my own face recognition algorithm using Keras. And then after a while, I said, boy, why am I devoting all this energy to this? Why don't I try using one of the off-the-shelf ones? And I tried using the selfie database from UCF. So I put the link here if you'd like to check it out. It's a really large, I think 46,000 selfie images. I tried using Google's face recognition software, and it worked really, really well. So a lot of this stuff is becoming commodity algorithms, where you can use the armies of research that have been done in especially face recognition. If you're doing research, for example, if you need, if you're doing some sort of medical research, like I was pursuing, where you needed like characteristics of people's noses and face and chin and that sort of stuff from profile images to diagnose breathing disorders and things like that. You can use facial recognition. They give you a lot of the characteristics, and this stuff has become kind of commodity algorithms. So I processed these 46,000 images in not that long at all. Another area that I work in is in radiology, and I just wanted to put up this quote by Jeff Hinton. So I have the video here. I won't play it. You should watch it. It's embedded in the video, so you can play it there. But just let me give you some key quotes. So Jeff Hinton is one of the leaders in deep learning research. He's been doing it for quite some time, and a lot of the major discoveries have come from his lab. And in this recent talk, he said, if you work as a radiologist, you're like the coyote that's already over the edge of the cliff. He means Wile E. Coyote from the Looney Tunes videos. That hasn't looked down and doesn't realize that there's no ground underneath him. People should stop training radiologists now. And it's completely obvious that within 5, or he kind of hedges a little bit, between 5 and 10 years, deep learning is going to do better than radiologists. So he's suggesting that in 5 to 10 years, we're going to go from this to this. Now, I know a bunch of radiologists, and it is interesting to note that the American College of Radiology, the radiology departments, they're very much so preparing for this future. Their goal is to train radiologists to be much more technically minded, much more like artificial intelligence researchers, or at least having much more of that in their training and in their knowledge base. So I think probably the future is that the radiologist is going to be something like this, a much more technology-oriented MD than most of the other medical fields. So in terms of statistics and statisticians, one comment I kind of wanted to make when I was giving this talk was the idea that these models are definitely not parsimonious. If you look, I fit the dogs versus cats example from the Deep Learning with R book. It winds up with 3 million parameters and a couple thousand images. Now it needs some form of regularization. There's dropout and things like that help regularize the problem to make the model estimable. But the fundamental idea is that these algorithms sacrifice some parsimony and sacrifice some interpretability for improved performance. And you need a lot of data, of course, to fit them, if you're going to fit them with 3 million parameters like this. So I would say the question is not so much whether we should eliminate parsimony in favor of deep learning, but whether or not kind of traditional statistics should make room for one more, and make room for one more technique that maybe doesn't focus so much on parsimony, since the vast majority of statistical techniques exclusively focus on prioritizing simplicity of models and interpretability of models over all else. And so I think we should think about some instances where parsimony is less important of a criteria and maybe apply some of these techniques there. So I thought I'd give you some examples of some exciting research that has come out in just the past couple of years where people have been doing exactly this in medicine and public health. So here's an example in dermatology where people have looked at mole classification. Anyone who's had a mole screening has seen that the dermatologist will look at moles. They'll usually take out what's like a little it's a magnifying glass effectively, but they'll take this magnifying glass that's sort of specialized for this problem, look at the moles very carefully, and they are able to recognize things that definitely an MD who isn't a dermatological specialist wouldn't notice. And so at any rate, they took dermatological classifications on mole images, and they trained convolutional neural networks to look at them. And they did many layers. Here's the kinds of images they were looking at. They had different kinds of moles, and then they had the pathology to verify. And they compared. Again, maybe ROCs aren't the best way to do this, but they compared the ROC curve with the ROC curve of human radiologists and human dermatologists, and they find that it does pretty well. So it's a very encouraging finding. Of course, there's a lot more work to get something like this into practice and verify that it's really working as advertised and so on and so on. But it's a very promising idea. It fits well within the idea of what deep learning is, where deep learning is doing the best. It's doing the best in image classification and perception tasks, and this is obviously a perception task. Another instance where people are extremely excited about the possibility of deep learning is in electronic health records. Here is another paper that made quite a splash in our field. And what was interesting about this paper, so they were predicting things like inpatient mortality. And in this case, they look at the area under the ROC curve for predicting inpatient mortality. They see that their deep learning models are doing much better than the baseline model, which honestly is a bit of a straw man. It's a regression model with 24 parameters or some 24 predictors or something like that. So they are kind of beating up on an algorithm that I think a lot of machine learning approaches or other statistical approaches could beat pretty easily. But there's this interesting quote from the paper that I want to highlight, which is, however, the novelty of the approach does not lie simply in the incremental model performance improvements. Rather, this predictive performance was achieved without hand selection of variables deemed important by an expert. So at any rate, you can read the full quote. But at any rate, what they're saying is what was interesting was the feature selection part of this, that they really didn't put a lot of effort into feature selection, that deep learning was able to find features and improve on the regression model that is the sort of standard in this area without a lot of human input. So I think that it's an exciting finding. Still has to be validated with future studies and other things like that to get it implemented. But though it is of course promising. Another Jeff Leake sent me this great paper about combining satellite imagery and machine learning to predict poverty. So getting good SES and poverty statistics in rural areas is often quite hard. We don't have great data. So one way to get at that, to get summaries is from satellite imaging. And you might imagine, things like nighttime images, the density of lights in the area would be a predictor of poverty. That big rich cities will be lit up like the sun during the night, and poor rural areas will have less light. And so that's kind of what people would naturally gravitate to, some sort of image processing where they took specific frequencies of the images and looked at those. Well, they instead did this with deep learning. But what was interesting about this is they used convolutional layers that were trained on another data set. So they used transfer learning. And that's what was kind of novel and interesting about this, is that not only did it pick up the kind of lighting information that otherwise would have been picked up, but they picked up interesting things about roads and edges and other things that are kind of harder to detect. But the convolutional layer had it wasn't trained on this outcome in specific. It was trained on a completely unrelated set of images. But those images had edges and boundaries and all these other things that these images have as well. And those things are apparently important for predicting poverty. So that was kind of the novel part of this application. This obviously has public health implications, because so much of what we do in public health, especially in third world countries, is we need estimates of socioeconomic status and things like that to perform the kinds of studies that people do. Okay. The last thing I wanted to talk about was something that's kind of idiosyncratic to areas I work in image registration. So in brain imaging, what we're typically interested in as a first step is morphing brains into a common geometry. The reason for this is so that we can hopefully then compare across subjects. And so we try to match the brains under the principle that structure and function are quite related. And so maybe 40 or so years of research has been done on this geometry problem. It's very hard. It requires some fancy mathematics, and some great people have worked on it, and they've come up with very good solutions. So one day I was talking with my friend, and I said, hey, I wonder, and these solutions tend to be quite time consuming. So I said, I wonder if we can just train based on these algorithms where we know the truth, we know what the good registration will give us. If we can train something like a convolutional deep learning approach where we then approximate it really well, and that will be quite fast to execute. So we'll use these the 30, 40 years of research, these geometry algorithms to create the gold standard. We'll use that gold standard to train the deep learning algorithm. The deep learning algorithm, when we were to implement it on new images to put them into this common geometry, that would be quite fast. Well, it turns out someone else already did it, and they did a pretty neat implementation of it, fast predictive image registration. So this was kind of a neat paper. When I read it, I was stunned, that they did it. So, that they kind of done it, jumped on it pretty quickly as an idea. It was done, and it's a very interesting idea. But what I find fascinating about this, and why I wanted to bring it up, was you can imagine imagine if we didn't have that 30 years of mathematical geometry research on the image registration problem. We could manually register images and subvert all that work, because if you have enough trained images, then you could have just trained the deep learning algorithm just on the training data that was manually registered by hand. And of course, that would be slow and time consuming. But if you did a couple of thousand of them, then you could get a good algorithm out of it. So I think that's kind of fascinating. The idea that we, is this happening right now, where there are things where we would need to devote decades of math research to solve it, but it's getting solved approximately by collecting lots of data. So in other words, are we going to get to the point where instead of hiring a biostatistician, that's what our biostatisticians will look like? So everything I've been saying has been a pretty rosy picture of these algorithms. And, there's many reasons to be cautious. And I think in this talk, and especially for the reason that it was given for JJ's visit, we were quite, we're presenting a very bullish picture of deep learning and artificial intelligence, specialized artificial intelligence. But of course, there's a lot of reasons to be cautious about this. And of course, one of them is that just because something gives you good prediction doesn't mean that it's particularly scientifically meaningful. I'll give you not an AI, but a machine learning instance of this. When we engaged in this attention deficit hyperactive disorder, ADHD, prediction competition from neuroimaging data, what we found was that these kind of weird regions were predictive of ADHD status. And eventually what we decided was what we were really getting at was motion, that people moved in the scanner, and that likely kids with ADHD tended to move a little bit more in the scanner than typically developing kids. So that's not a terribly scientifically interesting finding. It doesn't further the understanding of the neuroscientific basis of attention deficit disorder all that well. And in fact, the finding was explored and in subsequent related data was really kind of nailed down, and found that even among people who were trying very hard to control for motion in neuroimaging, there was still some leaking in. This great paper by Power and Peterson et al. Was really kind of a bombshell dropped on the neuroimaging community, where we had thought we had been addressing motion quite well, and it turns out that there was some residual motion left over. So it was nice to see that we weren't crazy, and that other people found similar things. And this was really quite a nice paper. So if you're into fMRI and that sort of thing, you should definitely be following up the research by these folks. But the broader point for this talk is that just because something comes up as a meaningful predictor doesn't mean that it's scientifically meaningful or even generalizable, right? If you have a place that does a very good job about keeping people very still in the scanner versus a place that doesn't do as good of a job, then your predictions are going to be different. The quality of your predictions is going to be different in this case. Now, obviously, in neuroimaging, people are trying to go through the steps to both in acquisition and in analysis to address this. But the only reason they know to do that is because people like Power and Peterson and all figured out exactly what was going on, and they're trying to come up with steps to address it. But if you pursue it purely with kind of non-parsimonious machine learning approaches, you may lose out on that. Another thing that's talked about quite a bit in the artificial intelligence and machine learning literature right now is the impact of things like bias. So as an example, if you were an insurance company and you were figuring out insurance rates, you're not allowed to discriminate based on, let's say race. But if you have an artificial intelligence algorithm that's determining your insurance rates, you may say, you may not put race in the model, but it can figure out a way to guess race really well with all of the other information that is in the model, so that it can effectively be using race despite race not being used as one of the predictors in the model. So that can create a bias that's, in this case, that would be actually illegal in this case, perhaps without the knowledge of the researchers. Now, I think everyone is pretty cognizant of these kinds of potential problems in artificial intelligence now, and they're working hard to address them. And I've seen some commercial products coming out to try and address these sorts of things. But this is just two examples of many reasons to be cautiously optimistic about the role of artificial intelligence. I still remain optimistic, though. I think it's an interesting set of tools, and I certainly think for people like me who trained in parsimonious statistical models, it represents a new way of thinking that is clearly offers some benefit in many circumstances to the ways that from the ways that I traditionally approach problems, which is to use as few parameters as possible, try to explain it as much as possible with interpretable models. I think there are certainly instances it's looking like where maybe you want a little less parsimony. Okay, so that was the introduction, and at any rate, I have this picture that said thanks. So thanks again for listening. If you get a chance, subscribe to the YouTube channel. And we have our weekly newsletter, Monday Morning Data Science. Please subscribe to that, where we post some content from the Data Science Lab at Johns Hopkins every week, telling you what's going on. And we also put in some links and other things like that have caught our eye. Okay, well, thanks a lot for tuning in. And hopefully I'll see you next week.